325ers, welcome back. We are now moving out of the colonial period. You'll remember we kind of hit the greatest hits when it came to indigenous migration, European immigration, and African forced migration into the colonies. And now what we're moving into is really the creation of the United States and what that means for American immigration, and how Americans are going to decide immigration policy, who can be an American, and really what is that going to mean, right? Because what is really interesting, before I go to the outline, let's just go to the outline. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the Revolution, what it does to American immigration. We're going to talk about the Constitution and what it says about immigration. Spoiler alert, not much, but we'll talk about why. And then we're going to talk about the early American Republic. And really what we're going to look at is from the ratification of the Constitution until about the end of the War of 1812. We'll pick up with the aftermath, well, not the aftermath, but the world after the War of 1812 into the Civil War in the next lecture. So what is really interesting about the Revolution and revolution immigration is the reality of immigration and then the effect, right? So what did immigration look like during the Revolution? It was negligible. And we're going to see this, in fact, throughout U.S. history. Whenever there is a war, immigration is going to be minimal. Because the reality is, again, remember, people are largely coming for economic reasons. You're not going to make a lot of money with a country that's at war, right? So, and the revolution is no different. People don't want to immigrate into a war-torn society. And what is important to know about the revolution is that this is in many ways a civil war. We can banter back and forth about that term, but the reality is that a group that identified themselves as British was trying to separate themselves from the British Empire. And so in many places, this war is going to be incredibly bloody, incredibly violent, and people aren't going to want to immigrate into that situation. Now, importantly, when we look at the broader effect of the war, when we look at the participants in the war itself, the American Revolution was the first of what we call the Age of Revolutions. This includes the American Revolution, the Dutch Patriot Revolt, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, which is arguably more important than those others outside of the American Revolution. And so what this is going to do is create an idea and create a conversation about what a society should look like, how a society should be governed, what are the type of people that they want in that society that are best able to take it forward. Also, the American Revolution is a world war. If you know your American Revolutionary history, largely what we do to track the revolution is we start with the 7 Years' War that ends in 1763, and then work our way up into where Americans simply can't take it anymore, and they have to rebel, right? The 7 Years' War was also a world war. The American Revolution is going to be much of the same. You're going to have the French fighting in the American Revolution. You're going to have the Dutch. You're going to have Prussians. You're going to have native peoples. You're going to have Irish, Germans, right? Hessian troops, for examples. You'll see, famous Frenchmen, the Marquis de Lafayette, General Rochambeau, famous Prussians, Baron von Steuben, who's going to train Washington's troops at Valley Forge. An interesting tidbit, at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, which is largely considered the beginning of the end of the Revolution, French troops outnumbered American troops 2-1. Right? So this is an international affair. Immigration itself was negligible. Many people were involved in this. Many people are going to recognize what the United States is trying to do. Of course, they're going to have something to say about it. There's going to be reactions to that. Lastly, you'll see though the last point down there are loyalists, right? Loyalists are people who are supportive of the crown, although loyalist is a bit of an awkward phrase in many ways Because what happens during and after the revolution is there's going to be a loyalist exodus, much of it forced. About 100,000 loyalists are going to move out of the United States. Many of them will move into Canada. Some of them will move into the Caribbean. Many others will try to move back to England. But you're going to have a large and significant population of people moving out of the country just as it's trying to establish itself. And importantly, for the core of this group, these are people opposed to the idea of the United States, right? These are people who are going to be naysayers, for lack of a better word, when it comes to the creation of the United States. So it's important that they are now gone, that large chunk of people cannot have a voice or will not have a voice in these settlements. Now, I mentioned in the first slide, right? The interesting thing about the revolution is that its reality versus its impact. While few people are coming to the United States during the revolution, that doesn't mean that the revolution doesn't have a dramatic impact on immigration in America, and particularly right into the United States. Because importantly, what the Americans are arguing for are what we now refer to as natural rights, as rights that are not given by any form of government, but are rights that exist within people for time immemorial, right? You were born with these rights. No one grants them to you, right? This is Enlightenment rhetoric that we're talking about. What does that mean for immigration? If you remember back to the previous lecture, I mentioned that the overwhelming majority of people coming into North America during the colonial period are unfree. That is going to shift after the American Revolution. In fact, we'll talk about this in a minute, but the transatlantic slave trade is going to end in 1808. Up until that period, over 90% of all people immigrating into the United States are going to be free. There's going to be an emphasis on this idea of freedom. Now, it's contingent, right? And it's largely contingent on whiteness, and it's contingent on certain other factors, but whiteness is a centrality of this. But it is an important shift, right? You're not going to have convicts that are going to be able to come into Britain. Importantly, Britain can no longer simply dump convicts into North America. This is where they're going to move to Australia, for anybody familiar with that history. They used to do it in North America. Australia is now going to be the new dumping ground because of this fact that this argument against deference, against this unquestioning authority that you should know your place in society and stick to it, that is going to be undermined by the American Revolution. And in fact, indentures are going to dramatically drop after the American Revolution. Indentured had been a key way that many people immigrated into North America. As I mentioned, Germans were a large population that used what they called the redemptioner system. But that is going to largely end after the Revolution because those types of contracts, these onerous types of contracts, are going to be undermined by the American Revolution itself, by the rhetoric of the American Revolution. I do want to go back. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself there a little bit. Another impact of the revolution is going to be an overemphasis on the Britishness of the U.S. population. If you remember back to last week's lecture, one of the things that we emphasized was the great diversity and great complexity of all of these American societies. And in fact, in some measure, right, that's what makes these societies American. When these British colonists are deciding to revolt, when they're deciding that they can no longer be a part of the British Empire, they're also articulating a new identity as American. And in doing so, they're largely going to downplay, elide, or simply ignore all of the history that surrounded them. If you are familiar with the Boston Tea Party, for example, right? The people that jump on the ships, dump the tea into the harbor are dressed as native peoples. Now, there's this myth that these were disguises. They weren't, right? These were terrible disguises because everyone knew who these people were. They didn't hide their identity at all. What they did do, however, was articulate a new identity for these British subjects as American citizens, right? No longer are they a part of the British Empire. They are something new. They are American. An American, however, which is not a native person, right? An American also that's largely not going to be an enslaved person as well, right? We mentioned before that enslaved peoples are racialized as black, they're racialized as African, or coming from Africa. Those people as well are going to be excluded from this idea of America, which is going to have tremendous consequences for both Native peoples and Africans. And we can actually see that as the United States tries to figure out what they're going to do with their society, right? One of the most important things about the Constitution is probably something that we largely forget about the document itself, which is that it's a document, that it's written down, that you can actually go to it and read it and claim these are the rights that I have codified as an American. You didn't have that. There's no, say, British Constitution that you can go to, grab and hold in your hands. That's not going to be the case. All these things are going to be codified. They're going to be written down. These aren't going to be all common law as you see in the British Empire. So what does the Constitution say about immigration? I gave you the spoiler alert earlier. It doesn't say much. The fact of the matter is that the Constitution, more or less, is a governing document. And it's a document about the creation of a government. And that's really its confines. And in fact, I would challenge you to think the first thing that you can think of when it comes to the Constitution is probably something that's not even in the Constitution itself. If you're thinking of the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, for example, due process, all of these things are in the Bill of Rights, which are amendments to this original document. They're not in the document itself. The document is actually rather straightforward in what it wants to accomplish. But it does talk in some sense about immigration and lightly touches upon kind of citizenship and what that means. And so one of the things that you'll find are limits that you have to be in the United States for so long to take certain offices, right? One of the things that we know about the presidency is you have to be a natural born citizen. You can't be a citizen from another country and become president of the United States, right? That's an acknowledgement of immigration. There's also Article 2, Section 1 states that, quote, no person except a natural born citizen or citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible for the office of the president, right? That's Article 2, Section 1. Outside of that, there's no definition of what a citizen is. There's no definition of what it means to be an American, what are the processes for that. The one thing that is mentioned, but not mentioned explicitly, is slavery. Slavery itself, as a word, is never mentioned in the Constitution, and yet slavery is all over the document itself. In fact, the Congress decides to regulate slavery, and by regulating slavery, they are articulating a protection of slavery. So, while slavery isn't mentioned, enslaved peoples are mentioned. Not explicitly, but implicitly. So we look at Article 1, Section 9. This is the passage. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. What in the world does that mean? That means that Congress isn't going to talk about the slave trade until 1808, right? Doesn't mention slavery, doesn't mention enslaved peoples, but it clearly references the migration and importations of such persons, right? A clause prior to that indicates that, in fact, they're talking about enslaved peoples. And so we can see right away, right, that enslaved peoples aren't considered for citizenship. They're considered in terms of another population. But what what do we do about citizenship, right? The Constitution doesn't say anything about it. Something needs to be said about it. And this is where we get the Naturalization Act of 1790. The definition of a citizen wasn't determined in the Constitution. It's determined in the Naturalization Act of 1790. And what does it say? It says, declared that, quote, any alien being a free white person had to live in a state for 2 years and then was eligible for naturalization. At this time, this is an incredibly expansive vision of who can be an American, who can become a citizen. Again, it does racialize it, right? It does racialize it as white, but whiteness is a very broad category. One of the things that we'll look at for the entire rest of the course is the ebb and flow of whiteness as people have their whiteness questioned, as they're able to incorporate themselves into this broader definition of whiteness. Particularly at this time, whiteness is a very broad category. What the Naturalization Act also does is it recodifies this emphasis on freedom. Convicts can't become citizens. Indentured people are going to have trouble becoming citizens. And the last thing that the Naturalization Act of 1790 does is it says that everyone has to declare an oath. Let me find it. They had to renounce any allegiance or fidelity to any other country. So when you come to the United States, and if you want to become a citizen in the United States, you have to renounce any connection to any other country. Why? What does that mean? Why is that a clause in the Naturalization Act of 1790? What it gets at is what it means to be a citizen. If you remember, as I'm sure you all do, right? Americans prior to the Revolution were in fact subjects. What subjecthood means is a permanent condition for life. You're born a subject of the king or a subject of the queen. Subjecthood, according to the English, never ends. You never cease being a subject. You don't get to decide to be a subject. You're born into it. To become a citizen is a voluntary action. You decide to become a citizen of the United States. You need to renounce your loyalty to another state so you can make the decision to become a citizen of the United States. This is an incredibly important concept moving forward, this idea of voluntary action. May explain why many don't consider enslaved Africans as immigrants because of this emphasis on the voluntary nature of citizenship. It's also an incredibly unstable concept. In fact, the entire government created by the United States, this idea of a republic, republics are notoriously unstable. In the United States at this period is incredibly unstable, right? They are arguably not even the most powerful entity in North America, right? As I mentioned, they represent less than 4% of the landmass of North America. In terms of peoples, there are native communities that still are far larger. We think about the Comanche Empire, still far larger than the United States at this time. But republics also, by investing authority in the people. Now, the people is a very nebulous term. It's certainly going to ebb and flow as we move through American history. But importantly, this isn't a divine right monarchy. For example, the people themselves, however defined, are going to determine the course of government. And people are notoriously unstable, right? They change their minds. They have differing ideas. There's going to be a balancing act that is going to be required for Americans moving forward, which is why citizenship is such a big deal. Now, the last one, Jefferson's fears. What did Jefferson fear? Jefferson was a consummate Republican. Jefferson fervently believed in the promise of the United States to form a better government and form a government more attuned to the will of the people. But he was fearful of immigration. But he was fearful of a particular type of immigration, and he was particularly fearful of monarchists. What he was afraid of people coming from England, people coming from France who still had held wide allegiance to their kings and wouldn't be able to get rid of that attachment. Jefferson was afraid that they wouldn't be able to put America first, that they would keep that country in their hearts, that former country, and that former king. And what Jefferson feared is that if enough of these people came over, and then enough of them came over at a particular moment in time, they would overturn the very minimal gains that the United States had made up to this point. Jefferson encouraged immigration. He saw the United States, we'll get to this in a minute, as an empire of liberty, but he did fear this particular migration of monarchists. Now, as we move forward in the early American Republic, right? So we largely talked about the Constitution as the United States and the people elected to Congress begin to actually govern. That instability, that indeterminate space that the United States occupies is going to become a liability in the eyes of many. And no event more exposes this than the French Revolution. The French Revolution begins in 1789, but in 1793 becomes incredibly radical. 1793 is when they behead the King of France. 1793 is when you begin to see these large attacks on the church as an institution in France. This is where you're going to see John Adams send over negotiators to try and talk the French out of attacking American ships in the Caribbean. When he sends over those negotiators, right, this is known as the XYZ affair. They're going to be told that they have to pay a bribe in order to talk to the French foreign minister. Now, the reality is that bribes in and of themselves aren't unusual. This isn't why the Americans rebuked the advance. But they weren't going to pay a bribe unless they were going to get something in return. Just meeting with the French foreign minister was not enough. They wanted a guarantee that the French would stop assailing American ships in the Caribbean. And the French refused to do this. Word gets back to people in the United States, and they respond in fury. The whole country goes wild with fury. And as a result of this antagonism, as a result of this, really now this fear of French radicals coming in to the United States, of radicals of any sort, people that Americans fear are going to overturn their societies, we see the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the Alien and Sedition Acts were made up of the Naturalization Act, the Alien Act, and the Alien Enemies Act, and the Sedition Act. I'm actually trying to find my notes on them. So what do these do? The Naturalization Act extends naturalization. So remember, the Naturalization Act of 1790, only 2 years. There's another act passed that extended it to 5 years. This specific Naturalization Act, the one in 1798, extends it to 14. They actually wanted 21, but they compromised at 14. Part of the reason that they do this is also in the middle of a great political upheaval in the United States, and one largely between Federalists and Jeffersonians, or what they term themselves as Republicans. Republicans had a tendency to rapidly naturalize certain immigrant populations in order to gain votes. And so this is also a political move on the part of not John Adams necessarily, but on the part of Federalists to stop a large number of future Republicans from being able to vote and being able to vote them out of office. In fact, as a side note, John Adams is largely tagged with the negativity of the Alien Sedition Acts. He largely opposed the aggressiveness of these acts. And these are largely passed over his protestations. The Alien Act. The Alien Act says that the president has the authority to deport any foreigner he believed was a danger to the peace and security of the United States. Aliens Enemy Act, along the same lines, but it gave the president a new wartime power that he could label any enemy alien, label an enemy, any alien from a foreign power whose homeland was at war with the United States. So if there was a Frenchman in the United States and the United States was at war with France, the president could declare that person an enemy of the state and have them removed. The Sedition Act, which is actually the one used more than any of these, said that it made it a crime to publish or say out loud anything, quote, false, scandalous, or malicious against the President of the United States, the Congress, or the United States in general. Even this, though, wasn't used terribly much, 10 times in the scope of 2 years. Because what happens, because of the Alien Sedition Acts, also because of the massive buildup in the Army and Navy in order to launch a quasi-war against France, the American people distrust the Federalists and they distrust John Adams. And they really find themselves appealed by Jefferson's appeal to republicanism, appeal to the people. And when they elect Jefferson in 1800, he lets the Alien Sedition Acts die in 1800. They only last 2 years, actually. But the election of Jefferson is also an incredibly important moment for the expansion of the United States. What Jefferson fervently believed was that the institutions of the United States could take someone and make them into a good American citizen. And part of those institutions was an agrarian republic. Jefferson fully believed in small farms and the ability of small farmers to gain independence for themselves and use that independence for other population, but also to stabilize the United States. Now, when it comes to immigration, one of the things that's also going to happen for Jefferson is literal expansion. We'll get to that in a moment, but Jefferson is going to encourage immigration in order to populate many of the western areas of the United States. We're also going to see a number of new states emerge during Jefferson's term, which is important because Jefferson wrote what we call the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. And what the Northwest Ordinance declares is that when any territory becomes a new state, it becomes a new state on equal footing with every other state, right? Just because, say, Massachusetts was one of the original 13 states doesn't mean that it has more rights or more privileges than, say, Kentucky does, or Tennessee, or Louisiana, or Missouri that's going to be created out of the Louisiana Purchase. And this is important moving forward because what we're going to see oftentimes is a hesitancy to make territory states unless they have an accurate reflection of what people like Jefferson deemed to be American citizens. So when we talk about probably the greatest expansion, not only Jefferson's term, but really American history, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Now, how do we get to Louisiana Purchase? We get to the Louisiana Purchase because of the Haitian Revolution, right? Napoleon, as he takes over the French Revolution goes through numerous cycles, and it ends with a dictator in Napoleon. Napoleon wants to reestablish New France in North America. Napoleon has grand designs on the entire world, some of which is in North America. And he begins to maneuver in some of these places, sending out agents and things of that nature. But one of the things that Napoleon can't do is stop the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution, which takes place in the Caribbean, is a slave-led revolt. They actually repel the French, they repel the British, and then they repel the French again. And Napoleon sinks so much money into the Haitians that he gives up on his dreams of expansion into North America. In fact, when Jefferson sends agents to talk to Napoleon, all Jefferson wants is access to New Orleans. He just wants access to the port and access to the Mississippi, right? When his agents go there, Napoleon says, take the whole thing. Now, Jefferson has a constitutional crisis with himself. Nowhere in the Constitution does it give the president the authority to purchase land from a foreign power, but he simply could not pass it up. This is an incredibly expansive swath of land, and it was incredibly cheap. Jefferson bought it for $15 million, which translates to about 3 cents an acre. Right? This is a landfall for Jefferson. Jefferson wants people to come in and begin farming this. But importantly, during this period, as America is conquering West, they're also incorporating all of these people that already live in these lands, right? Again, these aren't empty, right? It's not just immigrants coming into these places, especially a place like Louisiana, which had been Spanish and then French and then Spanish again, British for a little bit, and then American. There is a motley group of people that already live here. There are native groups that live all in these places. And so as America moves west, they're going to have to figure out what to do with these people. Remember, the states that that are carved out of these areas are going to have equal access as all of these other states. So what are we going to do about that? Now, at the same time, we're also going to see the end of the transatlantic slave trade in the United States. If you remember back to the Constitution, remember it said that Congress just isn't going to talk about it until 1808. Well, in 1808, they finally do talk about it, and they say that they're going to end it. No longer will enslaved peoples will continue to come in from the Atlantic slave trade. Now, this is important because it reaffirms the United States' commitment to free immigrants, right? This idea that if you're going to come to the United States, you're going to come of your volition, you're going to come free, because that's the type of immigrant that we want. Now, the reality as well is that what the end of the slave trade is contingent upon the explosion of an intrastate slave trade. Part of the reason why especially Southern congressmen are agreeable to ending the Atlantic slave trade in 1808 is because there are numerous slaves already in the United States. And remember, the reproduction of slaves also increases the wealth of those slave owners. And so what we're going to see after the end of the slave trade in 1808 is a massive forced migration from the upper South into the lower South, or what we know as the deep South. You're also going to see it in places from the north. New York City is going to gradually end slavery. Slavery will be outlawed in New York by the 1820s, and they're selling their slaves to D.C. Those slaves are then largely going to New Orleans. New Orleans is going to be the biggest slave market there is in North America. A lot of these slaves are coming out of Baltimore and going into New Orleans. Forced marches across overland, but also ships coming to New Orleans. Now, part of this is the transfer of wealth, right? And what we're going to see are incredible prices for enslaved peoples, right? We mentioned that slave families aren't protected. And this is a period, in fact, that we're going to see that testified more than any other. One historian estimated that between 1820 and 1860, an enslaved person was sold every 3.5 minutes. So every 3 minutes, roughly, some enslaved person was sold. Some mother, some father, children were sold into slavery during this time. It gives us a sense of the expanse of the slave trading system in the United States itself. Also for Jefferson, it is going to encourage this process that he referred to as diffusion. Now, if you remember, most slaves are largely in these areas right here. And Jefferson is worried that slavery is only going to be attached to those areas. That if slavery itself doesn't expand westward, that it is going to dry up, that it's going to see almost Virginian, right? And so he's worried about that. The intrastate slave trade takes care of that because it spreads slavery out, and it includes all of these other states as slave states, as states that are supported by slavery. Now, we're going to end with the War of 1812 and its effects of immigration. So we've seen Western expansion. The reality is that the populating the Louisiana Purchase isn't going to take place until after the War of 1812. Why is that? We'll get to that in a minute. Why in the world does the War of 1812 come about? Well, it originates out of aggressive moves by both France and Britain, especially on the Atlantic. More so Britain than France, but there's no doubt that both of them were antagonists toward Americans at this point. But for the British, there's this really interesting argument that goes back to our previous conversation about citizenship versus subjecthood. The British are impressing sailors on boats. And by that, I don't mean that the sailors are like, "Oh, Britain, you're so cool. I'm super impressed." What I mean is that they're forcing these sailors and saying that they're in fact British and arresting them and forcing them to work on British ships. The argument that the British have is that these are British sailors, who escaped the British Navy, and as subjects, they are continued to be British sailors. Many of these British sailors are either American citizens or sailors who declare themselves to be American citizens. So in some part, the British are denying the right of American citizenship in the Atlantic world. They're essentially saying that doesn't exist. You haven't ceased being a British subject. You can claim you're an American citizen all you want, but the fact of the matter is you have no authority to exert that on the Atlantic. And so that, amongst other things, builds resentment and anger within the United States, and then they go into war. Another part of the war is the Western lands in the United States. Not only do you have British troops, but you also have a growing and resentful Native Confederation that is being formed largely by two Native people, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. They're trying to form a confederation to join with the British to push back the United States. One of the things that the United States has done in terms of Western expansion is overtake native lands and largely remove natives from those lands. And so Tenskwatawa, Tecumseh are launching a confederation of native peoples against this, right? This is actually a good point as a reminder that native people aren't all one and the same, right? Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh represent one tribe of native peoples. They're trying to bring in a variety of different tribes to face off against the United States as one. But though all those tribes have their own individual interests in this as well. And so you have this desire to expand west that is being blocked by this Confederation of Native Peoples. And you also have this pressure from the east coming from British impressment of American sailors. And so fighting during the War of 1812 largely goes poorly for the United States. There's some early victories on the seas, but more or less, this is a disaster. The United States is not economically or militarily prepared for this war. While they win certain battles, they lose far more than others. Really, the only saving grace that the United States has is that Britain is also fighting another war in Europe at the time against Napoleon, a war that means more to them than does the War of 1812. After the Napoleonic War ends, Britain sends some more troops, and this is when we see the sacking of Washington, D.C. The British troops invade and light it on fire. So it gives you an idea of the type of fighting that is going on. However, Britain is tired of fighting. The Americans are tired of fighting. The War of 1812 ends with a treaty that declares the status back to and the antebellum period, right before the war itself. Pretty much that the war never happened. Now, there are important consequences. The British actually then recognize American borders to the north and especially to the west. The Native Confederacy that had been built up during the war breaks apart. And what we're going to see then is a large push of the United States in many places, ethnically cleansing those places of Native peoples. But we're also going to see more immigrants coming in because now those lands are secure, right? The War of 1812 is also a war about nationalism. It's a war about the United States, right? Even though the war really ends in a draw, and it ends in a draw because the British are tired, that doesn't mean that the Americans aren't going to proclaim victory, because they do. In fact, there's actually a massive American victory at New Orleans after the treaty had been signed, but nevertheless, led by Andrew Jackson, his troops take on a full British regiment and win at the Battle of New Orleans. This is going to inspire great patriotism within the United States. And so the stability, the securing of Western lands, and this sense of patriotism and Americanness, right? That they've defeated the British once again. And they've done so without French help, right? The French are largely out of the picture in terms of fighting on American soil. And we're going to see the consequences of what that means moving forward in terms of defining Americanness, but also in terms of immigration coming in to the United States during this time. Because one of the things that the war does show is that the United States is woefully unprepared industrially, and then this idea of an agrarian republic and non-manufacturing that Jefferson had invoked with his Empire of Liberty, that Madison had picked up as an acolyte of Jefferson, is not going to work. They're going to need industry, and they're going to need people to fill those positions. And that is what we'll pick up with the next lecture. But the War of 1812, although in terms of people coming in, like the revolution itself, has dramatic consequences on reshaping the format of the United States. So now we get to the conclusions, right? Out of all of this, right? The Revolution, the early American Republic, the War of 1812, where do we come out for this? Well, first and foremost, the American Revolution, although not many people came during the Revolution, fundamentally transforms the nature of immigration into the United States. It makes an emphasis on freedom versus unfreedom that had been the majority of people during the colonial period. What we also see is the origination of competing views of what makes a good immigrant, right? We have fear of radical French. We have the desire of removing peoples deemed to be not a part of the American fabric when we look at Native peoples and we look at enslaved peoples. And the government is going to begin to take some action to curb that immigration. The Alien Sedition Acts are really maybe the only active part of the American government to curb immigration or control it in some means. But what it's going to indicate is that the government has some role in this. And then finally, westward expansion is continually bringing in new citizens, not just from overseas immigration, but also from expansion, and in some sense, the forced incorporation of peoples. But what the War of 1812 does is it is going to provide a period of relative harmony in its aftermath, but it's going to secure Western lands for immigration. It's going to open up paths for the advancement of American citizens to the West, and it's going to assert a stronger sense of what it means to be an American.